In 2015, gang warfare gripped the tiny country of El Salvador, killing over 6,000 people in a single year. Its homicide rate of 103 deaths per 100,000 people made it the deadliest country on earth, 20 times more dangerous than the United States and 50 times more than Europe. But over the last 9 years, this has completely changed. In 2023, this figure had dropped to just 2.3 deaths, more than half the rate of the United States and 10 times less than Mexico. But how did they do it? Most of El Salvador's success is down to one person, Nayib Bukele. Since he came to office in 2019, he has pledged above all to reset the country after 30 years of gang dominance. And to beat the gangs, he's followed a surprisingly simple strategy: put criminals in prison. While this seems pretty obvious, El Salvador's execution of this strategy has been on another level. Their government has made use of their military and police force to execute a number of raids on high-profile gangs across the country, arresting 70,000 people, or about 1% of its entire population in a matter of years. The police would use the tactic of encirclement, creating perimeters around entire urban areas and slowly encroaching until they hit the epicenter, going house to house, building by building, arresting anyone committing crimes. From 2020, their prison population has more than tripled, as they have taken every measure possible to issue mass arrests of violent gang members and place them in high-security mega-prisons. The result? After 30 years of living in terror, life as normal is starting to return to El Salvador. Children are no longer afraid to walk to school, businesses are no longer getting extorted, and property values are rising as El Salvador is becoming a desirable destination. More tourists are visiting the country now, taking selfies at the National Library Bukele had built and filling the popular surf beaches. It's clear that Bukele deserves a lot of credit, getting to grips with a problem which has eluded all of his predecessors, and his country has shown their support by voting him back into office earlier this year with well over 80% of the vote. But this all comes with a slight catch. To implement such a fast crackdown on crime, many rights have been eroded, and lots of innocent citizens have also been caught in the crossfire, getting thrown into jail for absolutely no reason. But despite this, many governments and countries could have a lesson to learn. So let's take a look at how El Salvador solved its crime problem and why America can't. Despite tackling crime on the streets, El Salvador faces a surge in online crime, with more than 80% of their population having their data stolen in May 2024. If you've also had this issue, then you can fix it with Enquiries, the sponsor of today's video. When you use the internet, your data will have ended up all around the web when you make online purchases or create accounts. What's worse is that this data is actually being collected by brokers who are analysing and selling it to buyers all over the planet. I've had my data stolen in the past, and trust me, it's not fun, and it involves endless hassle trying to fix it. There are specific websites where people can directly find your information, and all someone needs to do is input your name and get access to information like your address, phone numbers, employment, and even info on your children. Which is why Enquiries is such an important service, as it removes all the data from brokers on your behalf. This process is 100% automated, and all you have to do is create an account, grant them access to work on your behalf, and then kick back and watch as your data disappears, and the amount of spam you receive drops to zero. It's really that easy, and all you need to do is visit enquiries.com/invisiblehand and use the code InvisibleHand at checkout. This will get you a special 60% off an annual plan, so check the link in the description to get started. Many people think gang warfare is a problem inherent to Latin America. After all, so many countries across Central and South America struggle with this problem. But the roots of El Salvador's gangs actually begin in the United States. At the start of the 1990s, El Salvador had just emerged from a brutal 12-year civil war between the US-funded government and left-wing, communist-leaning guerrilla groups. When this ended in 1992, the war had devastated the country and its economy. Over 75,000 people died, and the country was in a mess, with no real opportunity or future for its people. But this is where things start to get even worse. You see, in the heat of the Civil War, many Salvadorians fled to the United States to escape the conflict, particularly to Los Angeles because of its strong Hispanic population. Most settled in impoverished neighborhoods where they struggled to adjust and secure work, ultimately making them the perfect recruits for gangs. Two gangs in particular stood out, MS-13 and Barrio 18. Formed by El Salvadorians and Mexican migrants who had moved in the 60s and 70s, these gangs were initially formed to protect new migrants from being targeted from other gangs. But as their membership grew, their motives changed. They became more dangerous, engaging in drug trafficking, extortion, robbery, and murder. These gangs spread across America, reaching an estimated 46 states by the mid-1990s. This is where the US government stepped in, targeting their leaders and bringing in stricter migration policies which deported tens of thousands of Salvadorans with criminal records back to El Salvador. Many of these individuals had grown up in gang environments in the US and had little or no ties to El Salvador. But what they did have was an affiliation with gang culture, which was brought back to El Salvador in abundance. Once back, they found a country in ruins after a civil war, the perfect ground for breeding gang activity. The government was weak and lacked the resources and political will to address the growing gang problem, and combined with corruption and ineffective law enforcement, gangs started to flourish and weave their way into society, with entire areas of cities being declared as no-go zones. Extortion became rampant, with gangs demanding money from small businesses, bus drivers, and even schools. Those who could not pay faced brutal violence or death, and a climate of fear spread throughout the country. It became clear that something needed to be done. Bring in Mano Dura, or Iron Fist. This was the first attempt in a series of aggressive, hardline policies implemented by the Salvadoran government in the early 2000s to combat gang violence. Police were empowered to arrest anyone suspected of gang affiliation, often based on superficial criteria like tattoos, clothing, or even just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thousands of sometimes innocent men were placed into overcrowded prisons with awful living conditions. Their intentions were in the right place. The government clearly wanted to do something about crime. But instead of deterring gang members, the Mano Dura policies often led to greater solidarity within the gangs, as the awful conditions their prisoners were forced into created an us versus them mentality. Not only was the policy surrounded by corruption, but it didn't address the root causes, and gangs still bred because of the sheer poverty. This didn't really change, and El Salvador continued to be one of the most dangerous places in the world. Watching all this unfold was a relatively unknown but ambitious young man from a wealthy family in the country's capital, San Salvador. Nayib Bukele started out with a background in marketing, maybe explaining some of his clever PR displays, but that shouldn't discount the fact that his rise to power in El Salvador has been nothing short of meteoric. Starting as a young political outsider, he first made waves in 2012 by winning the mayoral election of Nuevo Cuscatlán, a small city near the capital, with a razor-thin margin of just 169 votes. He was an instant hit, forfeiting his salary to place into an education grant, modernising the town and implementing social programs that gained him national attention. In just 3 years, he was already the mayor of the nation's capital and pushed for innovative reforms and infrastructure projects, cementing his image as a forward-thinking leader. And after just another 4 years, he was elected president, running on his anti-corruption platform, Nuevas Ideas, positioning himself as a new voice against the country's entrenched political elites. From the start of his time in office, Bukele made swift action, and he has since become one of the most popular leaders in the world, as his reforms have brought an end to decades of terror and violence in El Salvador. The key to Bukele's relative success in breaking gang structures rests on 3 fundamental pillars: the use of extreme legal measures, a looser interpretation of gang affiliation, and the controversial but heavy use of political power to pull it off. Real change began in March 2022, after one of the worst mass killings in the country's history. 87 people were killed in a single weekend, in what was seen as a response to some of Bukele's previous measures. The response was immediate. Bukele placed the country into a state of emergency, a legal measure designed for temporary use in response to catastrophic events, such as earthquakes and pandemics. No Salvadoran government had ever taken this route to deal with the gangs, but using his immense public support and political power, Bukele aligned with lawmakers to put this through. These types of powers are designed for a month or two maximum, but in El Salvador they've been in place for over 2 years. This gives authorities the power to arrest anyone suspected of gang affiliation and hold them without trial indefinitely. It also removes a lot of freedom from the public. In the aftermath of the shooting, gathering in groups larger than 2, except for religious services, sporting events or meetings for cultural and economic purposes, became an arrestable offence. The Legislative Assembly also amended the Criminal Code to allow for 10 to 15-year prison sentences for anyone convicted of creating, reproducing or transmitting any visual content related to gangs or gang activity. These measures may seem draconian or like a nanny state, which truth be told, they kind of are, but they've also been the key difference in bringing about real change in the country. Now, security forces can make arrests quicker, without much evidence, and suspects can also stay in prison far longer, without the need for a trial or formal charges. In all, security forces arrested over 33,000 people in the first 2 months of the state of emergency. While this may have cleared up crime, it's also quite troubling. The state of emergency has suspended constitutional rights to defence, meaning detainees can be held indefinitely on vague charges, without the need for an arrest warrant or evidence to back up criminal allegations. Under the emergency laws, detainees also lose the right to a court hearing within 72 hours of arrest, and lawyers and civil society organisations have said they cannot speak to those detained. Uncorroborated raw intelligence, rumours, and information sourced from social media profiles have formed the basis of arrests. But ultimately, the people don't seem to mind this extreme approach, as their lives had been ruined by gang violence for so long. Before the state of emergency, gang permission was frequently required when transiting through disputed territories, whether for routine commutes or medical emergencies. In many areas, the gangs also had a grip on the local economy, dictating who could sell what and where. Given what the country is like now, it's easy to see why the public loved their new leader so much. By Western commentators, Bukele is viewed as a populist, running on an anti-establishment agenda and proposing sweeping agendas to solve the previous government's problems. However, unlike many populist figures, his policies have actually worked and he stood up to the test, and was re-elected this year, gaining a staggering 85% of the total vote, despite being unconstitutional to run for a second term. But having gained a grip on crime, Bukele is now faced with a much more daunting task, one which does not have as quick a fix. In order to stop committing crime, citizens need a better alternative. Currently, nearly 30% of El Salvadorians live in poverty, and the cost of most food items has increased by over 30% since the pandemic, far quicker than any minimum wages, and much faster than many in the country can afford. In conditions like these, it's easy to see how crime can prosper. The average monthly wage in El Salvador is a little over $400 each month, with many people living in troubling conditions. In these circumstances, gangs can appeal to young people who can't see a future for themselves, and can offer a quick, short-term plan to earn more money and also offer some sort of status. Put simply, poverty increases crime, and quite often violent crime. This study, based on data from counties in the US, found that the 10% of people living in the poorest counties had almost a 6 times higher homicide rate than the 10% living in the least poor counties. So while Bukele has been successful in soothing the symptoms, his next step now needs to be addressing the root cause and figuring out how we can make outcomes better for everyone in the country and reduce poverty. Only by creating a society where the opportunities to get a normal job are better than a life of crime will the problem be addressed. This will be slow, but the early signs look promising. Investment is beginning to flow into the country again, being seen as a cost-effective alternative to somewhere like Mexico, which has become relatively more expensive in recent years. But even though the security situation has improved, thousands of people still leave the country each year because of its dire economic conditions. And addressing this brain drain is the next step to making sure it develops as a country which can generate economic growth internally. Many of you may be wondering why the same sort of approach can't also be applied in the USA. Firstly, crime is highly nuanced, and not the same in every country. In El Salvador, criminal activities are concentrated among a few major gangs, operating in clearly defined urban areas, making it easier for authorities to identify and target offenders. By comparison, the situation in the USA is far more complex. with a diverse array of criminal organisations spread across various regions, which makes a similar targeted approach much less practical. Other practical considerations also include the sheer amount of money that has been placed on arresting large numbers of criminals and maintaining strict control over its prison system. El Salvador has spared no expense or legal freedom to address the issue, whereas in the USA, while law enforcement agencies are well resourced, they operate under a different set of legal and constitutional constraints that prevent mass detentions and extended emergency measures. Additionally, the methods used in El Salvador raise significant concerns regarding human rights and the erosion of democratic institutions. Bukele's tactics have involved mass arrests without due process, indefinite extensions of emergency measures, and a substantial concentration of power, often at the expense of judicial independence and civil liberties. While they may have a measure of political support in the USA, these sorts of tough actions would not fly under the constitutional protections that safeguard due process, the right to a fair trial, and freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. And perhaps most importantly, many of these measures in El Salvador have only been in place for 2 years, while under the umbrella of emergency powers. No one really knows what's going to happen next. Prisons could get overcrowded, poverty could stay the same, or Bukele could lose support. And this is what it boils down to. There is no denying that what Bukele has done in a few years is nothing short of a miracle. But the real proof of whether it's successful is how long he can keep it going for. If people are still living in lives of poverty, then things can change very quickly, and he may lose support. For now, he looks to be safe. Public support makes him one of the most popular leaders in the world, and he's got a control on the problem for the moment.